So the most important saint for Italians born in this region is Saint Francis of Assisi, because Saint Francis is the saint patron of Italy. His day is celebrated on the 4th of October, but it's not a day off in Italy. And usually on St. Francis Day, Pope Francis visits the city of Assisi, the motherland of St. Francis. Just the 4th of October, because it was the day of the death of St. Francis. He died in the year 1226, between the 3rd and the 4th of October at night, while St. Francis was born in the year 1182. But then on the details about the life of St. Francis, the guide in Assisi will tell you. El santo más importante para los italianos es sin duda San Francisco. One more saint very important born in this region was Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict is the saint patron of Europe. He was born in a small place called Norcia, here in Umbria. And Saint Benedict lived in the 6th century, so much earlier than Saint Francis. Saint Benedict is considered to be the saint patron of Europe, and also he is a very important saint because he founded the very first in Europe order of monks that was called after him, Benedictine monks, with the rule work and pray, ora et labora. And also Saint Benedict founded the very first monastery in Europe, that was the monastery of Monte Cassino on the halfway between Rome and Naples. Another region, very important for our excursion today, is St. Clare, also from Assisi, and we're going to start the visit of Assisi with the basilica dedicated to St. Clare. St. Clare founded the very first female order of Clarice nuns, and by her basilica still nowadays there is a convent of Clarice nuns. St. Clare in modern epoch, imagine, was proclaimed the saint of the television. That's really very real thing, because I am sure that you could never imagine that exists the saint patron of the television. But St. Clare is because, well, it's clear that in those times there was no television, but St. Clare had a gift to see the events at the distance, to see what was happening at the distance. And so for that gift she was proclaimed the saint patron of the telecommunications. Because, for example, in the end of her life she was very ill, and she was always living in the church San Damian outside of Assisi, and so she couldn't participate in the mass that was taking place on the opposite side of the city in St. Francis Basilica, but she could hear and imagine the whole mass, and so for that gift she was proclaimed the saint patron of the telecommunications. Now, one more famous saint born here, Saint Lady as well, Saint Rita of Cascia. Usually the tourists from the South America and from Lebanon know a lot about Saint Rita. For example, Brazilians and Lebanese tourists are very devoted to Saint Rita. Saint Rita was born in a place called Cascia, very close to Saint Benedict motherland. And Saint Rita is the saint of the miracles and the impossible. She was living between the 13th and 14th centuries, but she was proclaimed a saint just in the 20th century. And her sanctuary in the city called Cascia is very much visited by the pilgrims from all over the world. Last famous all over the world, not only in the Catholic world, is the saint patron of lovers. Who is the saint patron of lovers? Of those who are in love. The 14th of February. There are all the postcards that are sold everywhere. Saint Valentine was also from here, from Umbria, from the city Terni. So on the territory of Umbria there are a lot of sacred places, monasteries and churches that are visited by the pilgrims from all over the world. crossing a bit of the territory of the region of Tuscany. So you can say that they have been to Tuscany as well. At least have seen from the window. Tuscany is considered to be one of the most beautiful and famous regions of Italy, and one of its beauties, it's exactly the landscape that you can admire here. A lot of hills covered with olive trees here on the left, or the vineyards you will see later on. And also there are a lot of cypress trees, like high towers growing everywhere. And the houses, small houses, not in this case, yellow or brick houses covered with reddish tile roofs, and so all these companies put together create this beautiful landscape that has always inspired artists. Ahora hemos dejado la autopista, estamos recorriendo las carreteras rurales hasta.
We celebrate the feast day of Saint Francis of Assisi.
Saint Francis of Assisi is the founder of the Franciscan order, born at Assisi in Umbria, Italy, in 1181 AD. In 1182, St. Francis' father, Petrio, returned from a trip to France to find out his wife had given birth to a son. Far from being excited or apologetic because he'd been gone, Petrio was furious because she had his new son baptized Giovanni after John the Baptist. The last thing Petrio wanted in his son was a man of God. He wanted a man of business, a cloth merchant, like he was, and he especially wanted a son who would reflect his infatuation with France culture. So he renamed his son Francesco, which is the equivalent of calling him the Frenchman. Francis enjoyed a very rich, easy life growing up because of his father's wealth and the permissiveness of the times. From the beginning, everybody, and I mean everybody, loved Francis. He was constantly happy, charming, and a born leader. If he was picky, people excused him. If he was ill, people took care of him. If he was so much of a dreamer, he did poorly in school, no one minded. In many ways, he was too easy to like for his own good. No one tried to control him or teach him. As he grew up, Francis became the leader of a crowd of young people who spent their nights in wild parties. Francis himself, I lived in sin during that time. Francis fulfilled every hope of his father, even falling in love with France. He loved the songs of France, the romance of France, and especially the free, adventurous troubadours of France. And despite his dreaming, Francis was also good at business. But Francis wanted more than wealth, but not holiness. Francis wanted to be a noble, a knight. Battle was the best place to win the glory and prestige he longed for. He got his first chance when Assisi declared war on their longtime enemy, the nearby town of Perugia. Most of the troops from Assisi were butchered in the fight. Only those wealthy enough to expect to be ransomed were taken prisoner. At last, Francis was among the nobility like he always wanted to be, but chained in a harsh, dark dungeon. All accounts say that he never lost his happy manner in that horrible dungeon. Finally, after a year in the dungeon, he was ransomed. Strangely, the experience didn't change him. Finally, a call for knights for the Fourth Crusade gave him a chance for his dream. But before he left, Francis had to have a suit of armor and a horse. No problem for the son of a wealthy father. And not just any suit of armor would do, but one decorated with gold, with a magnificent cloak. Any relief we will feel in hearing that Francis gave the cloak to a poor knight will be destroyed by the boast that Francis left behind that he would return a prince. Francis never got farther than one day's ride from Assisi. There he had a dream in which God told him he had it all wrong and told him to return home. And return home he did. What must it have been like to return without ever making it to the battle? The boy who wanted nothing more than to be liked was humiliated, laughed at, called a coward by the village, and raged by his father for the money wasted on armor. Francis' conversion did not happen overnight. God had waited for him for 25 years, and now it was Francis' turn to wait. Francis started to spend more time in prayer. He went off to a cave and wept for his sins. Sometimes God's grace overwhelmed him with joy. But life couldn't just stop for God. There was a business to run, customers to wait on. One day, while riding through the countryside, Francis, the man who loved beauty, was so picky about food, who hated deformity, came face to face with a leper. Repelled by the appearance and the smell of the leper, Francis nevertheless jumped down from his horse and kissed the hand of the leper. When his kiss of peace was returned, Francis was filled with joy. As he rode off, he turned around for a last wave and saw that the leper had disappeared. He always looked upon it as a test from God that he had passed. His search for conversion led him to the ancient church at San Damiano. While he was praying there, he heard Christ on the crucifix speak to him. "Francis, repair my church." Francis assumed this meant church with a small c, the crumbling building he was in. Acting again in the impetuous way, he took fabric from his father's shop and sold it to get money to repair the church. His father saw this as an act of theft and put together with Francis cowardice, waste of money, and his growing disinterest in money made Francis seem more like a madman than his son. Petrio dragged Francis before the bishop and in front of the whole town, demanding that Francis return the money and renounce all rights as his heir. The bishop was very kind to Francis. He told him to return the money and said God would provide. That was all Francis needed to hear. He not only gave back the money, but stripped off his clothes, the clothes his father had given him, until he was wearing only a hair shirt. In front of the crowd that had gathered, he said, "Petrio Bernardum is no longer my father. From now on, I can say with complete freedom, Our Father who art in heaven." Wearing nothing but cast-off rags, he went off into the freezing woods, singing. And when robbers beat him later and took his clothes, he climbed out of the ditch and went off singing again. From then on, Francis had nothing and everything. Francis went back to what he considered God's call. He begged for stones and rebuilt the San Damiano church with his own hands, not realizing that it was the church with a capital C that God wanted repaired. Scandal and avarice were working on the church from the inside, while outside heresies flourished by appealing to those longing for something different or adventurous. Soon Francis started to preach. He was never a priest, though he was later ordained a deacon under his protest. Francis was not a reformer. He preached about returning to God and obedience to the church. Francis must have known about the decay in the church, but he always showed the church and its people his utmost respect. When someone told him of a priest living openly with a woman and asked him that meant the Mass was polluted, Francis went to the priest, knelt before him, and kissed his hands, because those hands had held God. Slowly, companions came to Francis, people who wanted to follow his life of sleeping in the open, begging for garbage to eat, and loving God. With companions, Francis knew he now had to have some kind of direction to his life, so he opened the Bible in 3 places. He read the command to the rich young man to sell all his goods and give to the poor, the order to the apostles to take nothing on their journey, and the demand to take up their cross daily. "Here is our rule," Francis said, as simple and as seamlessly impossible as that. He was going to do what no one thought possible anymore. Live by the gospel. Francis took these commands so literally that he made one brother run after the thief who stole his hood and offer him his robe. Francis never wanted to found a religious order. This former knight thought that sounded too military. He thought of what he was doing as expressing God's brotherhood. His companions came from all walks of life, from fields and towns, nobility and common people, university, the church, and the merchant class. Francis practiced true equality by showing honor, respect, and love to every person, whether they were beggars or pope. Francis's brotherhood included all of God's creation. Much has been written about Francis's love of nature, but his relationship was deeper than that. He calls someone a lover of nature if they spend their free time in the woods or admire its beauty. But Francis really felt that nature, all God's creations, were part of his brotherhood. The sparrow was as much his brother as the Pope. In one famous story, Francis has preached to hundreds of birds about being thankful to God for their wonderful clothes, for their independence, and for God's care. The story tells that the birds stood still as he walked among him, only flying off when he said they could leave. Another famous story involves a wolf that has been eating humans. Francis intervened when the town wanted to kill the wolf and talked the wolf into never killing again. The wolf became a pet of the townspeople, who made sure that he always had plenty to eat. The following gospel, literally, Francis and his companions went out to preach 2 by 2. At first, listeners were understandably hostile to these men in rags, trying to talk about God's love. People even ran from them, fear they'd catch this strange madness, and that they were right. Because soon these same people noticed that these barefooted beggars wearing sacks seemed filled with constant joy. They celebrated life, and people had to ask themselves, could one own nothing and be happy? Soon those had met them with mud and rocks, greeting them with bells and smiles. Francis didn't try to abolish poverty. He tried to make it holy. When his friars met some poorer than they would eagerly rip off their sleeves of their habit to give to the person. They worked for all necessities and only begged if they had to. But Francis would not let them accept any money. He told them to treat coins as if they were pebbles in the road. When the bishop showed horror at the friary's hard life, Francis said, if we had any possessions, we would need weapons and laws to defend them. Possessing something was the death of love for Francis. Also, Francis reasoned, what could you do to a man who owns nothing? You can't starve a fasting man. You can't steal from someone who has no money. You can't ruin someone who hates prestige. They were truly free. Francis was a man of action. Simplicity of life extended to ideas and deeds. If there was a simple way, no matter how impossible it seemed, Francis would take it. So when Francis wanted approval for his brotherhood, he went straight to Rome to see Pope Innocent III. You could imagine what the Pope thought when this beggar approached him. As a matter of fact, he threw Francis out. But when he had a dream that this tiny man in rags held up a tittling lantern basilica, he quickly called Francis back and gave him permission to preach. Sometimes this direct approach led mistakes that corrected with the same spontaneity that he made them. Once he ordered a brother who hesitated to speak because he stuttered to go preach, half naked. When Francis realized how he had hurt someone he loved, he ran to town, stopped the brother, took off his own clothes, and preached instead. Francis acted quickly because he acted from the heart. He didn't have time to put on a role. Once he was so sick and exhausted, his companions borrowed a mule for him to ride. When the man who owned the mule recognized Francis, he said, "Try to be as virtuous as everyone thinks you are, because many have a lot of confidence in you." Francis dropped off the mule and knelt before the man to thank him for his advice. Another example of his directness came when he decided to go to Syria to convert the Muslims while the Fifth Crusade was being fought. In the middle of the battle, Francis decided to do the simplest thing and go straight to the Sultan to make peace. When he and his companions were captured, the real miracle was that they weren't killed. Instead, Francis was taken to the Sultan, who was charmed by Francis and his preaching. He told Francis, "I would convert to your religion, which is beautiful one, but both of us would be murdered." Francis did find persecution and martyrdom of a kind, not among the Muslims, but among his own brothers. When he returned to Italy, he came back to a brotherhood that had grown to 5,000 in 10 years. Pressure came from outside to control this great movement, to make them conform to the standards of others. His dream of radical poverty was too harsh, people said. Francis responded, "Lord, did I tell you they wouldn't trust you?" He finally gave up authority in his order, but he probably wasn't too upset about it. Now, he was just another brother, like he'd always wanted. Francis's final years were filled with suffering as well as humiliation. Praying to share in Christ's passion, he had a vision receiving the stigmata, the mark, the nail, and the lace wounds that Christ suffered in his own body. Years of poverty and wandering had made Francis ill. When he began to go blind, the Pope ordered that his eyes be operated on. This meant cauterizing his face with a hot iron. Francis spoke to Brother Fire. "Brother Fire, the Most High has made you strong and beautiful and useful. Be courteous to me now in his hour, for I have always loved you, and temper your heat so that I can endure it." And Francis reported that Brother Fire had been so kind that he felt nothing at all. How did Francis respond to blindness and suffering? That was when he wrote his beautiful Canticle of the Sun that expresses his brotherhood with creation in praising God. Francis has never recovered from this illness. He died on October 4th, 1226, at the age of 45. Francis is considered the founder of the Franciscan order and the patron saint of ecologists and merchants.
A